Humanities 320, the history of contemporary music. Pay attention, there's a lot coming up in the next couple of minutes. We'll be sharing with you some exciting things about the big generational line, today's topic. Well, that's our theme music. I'm Tom Zarecki. If you're not part of this class, go have a sandwich. You can come back later anytime you like. We've got students here that have things to learn, and that's what we'll be talking about in the next few minutes. Specifically, what I've got on the board, the big generational line. Since the class is the history of contemporary music, it's important that we address what it's all about and what this generational line was. But let me tell you, depending on who you talk to, that big generational line is either in the 50s or in the 60s. There was a giant line, and nothing like it has happened since then, that separates old people or parents and grown-ups from young people or kids and hip youngsters, as they used to be called. This line occurred twice in contemporary music history, but most people will only refer to one of them, but you never know for sure which one they're talking about. So let me tell you about both of those generational lines. There actually are two, and they separated again the world of the older established people from the world of the younger, hipper people. The first time it happened was in 1955. In fact, I'm going to write it down. There are two very specific years. 1955. And the other one, here they are. If you learn nothing else about music history, remember these two dates. 1955, and here's the other one, 1964. That's when those two generational lines occurred. Different times. No one else will necessarily recall both of them to you, but anyone that grew up during those periods of times definitely recalls either one or the other, sometimes both. But quite often, people that were growing up ended up on the other side of the generational line, depending on their age. And let's talk about each of them briefly in this brief video. Remember, all the videos that we present are all less than 10 minutes, so if you have 10 minutes, you have time to listen to this. And I only have about 8 of those minutes left, so let's go. This big generational line. Let's talk about the one, first of all, that happened in 1955. As you know from the videos you may have seen, when rock and roll debuted and exploded onto the music scene in 1955 with Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Bo Diddley type R&B artists, and then in the very next year in 1956 with Elvis Presley's first chart-topping hits. He was out in 55. People started learning about him, but then he really exploded onto the music scene in 56 and really proved that this was a whole new thing. The only thing similar to it was perhaps hip-hop music many decades later, but it didn't have that same separational feel as music did in 1955 and 56. It clearly drew line one of the generational lines between the older people and the younger people. And it was right in the middle of the decade, too. Now, today, when you look back, here's the other things you need to know. Almost done with this section, but I'll tell you right now. You need to know this. When people talk about the 50s, just average people, and you read about the phrase, the 50s, in music, or in anything, in history, if you read the phrase, the 50s, what it really means, in almost all cases, don't tell anybody, is this. 1955 to 1963. The 50s, you would think, would mean 1950 to 1960, right? But that's not really the case because of what happened in contemporary music at the time. So when people talk about the 50s, they really talk about 55 to 63. In fact, even today on satellite radio, when they have separate channels for the 50s and 60s, they really use this dividing line. When they play music from the 50s, it's really from 55 to 63, and accordingly, when people talk about the phrase the 60s, what they're talking about is really 1964 to 1970, okay? When people say the 60s, they really mean in terms of lifestyle and change and music and what went down in the streets back then. It was really occurring between 1964 and 1970. Not really, as you might think, 1960 to 70. It was really 64 to 70. These are important numbers. I'm not going to give you too many dates and times and stuff like that in this class, but these are really critical. So again, the 50s, 55 to 63, and the 60s, 64 to 70. Any more things to block out my face from the picture? So let's talk about those in the next video, and we'll talk specifically about what television shows influenced this and how lifestyle changed at the time. In the next video, we'll talk about the introduction of TV, how it changed culture, and what very specific TV shows were out there. I mean, today you can watch many, many networks and many television stations and channels and get a feel for the culture. Back then, everybody around the United States really had access to 2 or maybe 3 television channels, and that, ladies and gentlemen, was it. Those were your only choices. And everything by today's standards was so conservative and so laid back, it took a few, let's call them reality shows of their time in the 50s and then in the 60s that really helped contemporary music spread throughout the land. And we'll talk about that in the next video. Thanks.